My name is Martine Hackett, and I'm an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Population Health. I've also had the privilege of being one of the coordinators of the Presidential Symposium. So welcome to the second annual Hofstra University Presidential Symposium Solutions for Sustainable Tomorrow. We have assembled 3 days for this symposium of speakers, discussions, and events to explore how Hofstra University can be part of the solution for a sustainable tomorrow. Sustainable solutions can be found at the intersection of science, economics, social equity, with education also playing an important role. And there's little doubt that climate change is our largest and most daunting sustainability challenge. We have structured the symposium around 3 key themes. Yesterday was leading by example, Hofstra's role in building a sustainable tomorrow. And here we addressed what Hofstra is doing and what Hofstra should be doing, perhaps isn't yet, to be a sustainability leader. Today is devoted to addressing and adapting to climate change. Later, another panel will talk about the role of government regulation in addressing pollution and climate change. And tomorrow, we will conclude with local initiatives, Hofstra's role in supporting sustainable communities. Panels tomorrow will consider how Hofstra's faculty and programs are collaborating with local communities to promote sustainable outcomes. And when it comes to thinking about this, I encourage all of you to consult the symposium program online, and also I saw that there are plenty of copies of the program out front, and to attend any programs tomorrow. I hope you discover there's a lot happening here with a lot more to come. So thank you, and I turn it over to our panel and the start of this discussion. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome to session 6 of Hofstra University's Presidential Symposium. My name is Andrew Foreman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Marketing, International Business, and Legal Studies. Excuse me. And I'm pleased to serve as your moderator today. Our topic for this session, sustainability, science, regulation, and compliance. And our discussion centers on a fundamental question. As both Main Street and Wall Street confront internal and external pressure in the protection of the environment, does science drive the regulation, or is it the other way around? The answer to that question requires a multidisciplinary perspective that brings together knowledge of science, law, and business. And as such, we're pleased to have panelists today representing 3 esteemed schools at Hofstra University: the Fred Mateus School of Engineering and Applied Science, the Maurice A. Dean School of Law, and the Frank G. Zarb School of Business. Some of the most pressing questions center on the development of effective science-based regulations excuse me, to tackle complex issues related to climate change, the authority of federal agencies to reinterpret their mission, and practical accounting, reporting, and auditing considerations attending to such newly acquired filings. We will start with the perspective from the science point of view, then move on to the regulatory environment, and finally to the accounting and compliance considerations. After the panelists have presented, we will open the floor to questions. Our first panelist, Dr. Mijing Su, started as a faculty member at the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Hofstra University this fall. Prior to joining Hofstra University, she received her bachelor's and master's degree in chemistry at the University of Oxford, then a PhD in chemical and environmental engineering at Yale University. Her research interests are in environmental engineering, specifically understanding and developing sustainable water treatment technologies.
Trying to bring up my slides. Okay. Oh, yeah. Thank you for that kind introduction. My name is Minjang Sa. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Engineering and Applied Science, and I started this fall. And today I'm excited to start this panel discussion on sustainability, science, regulation, and compliance. And specifically, we're going to be discussing this new rule proposed by the SEC. So prior to this new rule, the SEC mandated that public companies make disclosures in required filings of all material climate-related issues. And they're proposing this new rule, and this would require companies to significantly increase their reporting on climate risks. What does this include? If adopted, this would require public companies to provide detailed reporting of their climate-related risks, emissions, and net zero transition plans. And why are they doing this? So in the words of the SEC chair, it's to provide investors with consistent, comparable, and decision-useful information for making their investment decisions. And it would provide consistent and clear reporting obligations for the issuers. So with this brief introduction in mind, I want you to think about this key question of, does science drive regulations, or do regulations drive science? And more specifically, should science be the basis of these environment and sustainability-related rules and regulations? And to provide some context, I'm going to be discussing how environmental regulations in the US come to play, and compare and contrast that to this SEC's proposed new rule of climate risk disclosure. So in the US, environmental regulations are often proposed by the federal regulatory agencies. This includes the EPA and the FDA, and these are groups authorized by the Congress to write regulations that explain the critical details necessary to implement these laws. Environmental regulations are also implemented on the state level as well. And these include environmental laws and executive orders. Some of you may be familiar with the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, and most recently the Inflation Reduction Act. And this also includes regulatory limits for contaminants and toxic substances. So what's the maximum level of a toxic substance we can have in the drinking water before it presents a public health threat, for instance? So to better understand how environmental regulations are developed and implemented, I'm going to bring up the example of a toxic chemical called BPA, bisphenol A, and it's the molecule shown up there. And some of you may have reusable plastic water bottles in this room, and I'm sure most of it says BPA-free plastic. So BPA is a chemical used in plastics, specifically polycarbonates, and it was invented nearly 120 years ago. And it's used in these plastic water bottles, as well as epoxy linings in metal food cans, so like the ones that contain food or infant formula. Although its long-time use in consumer products came with assurance of its safety, it's a ubiquitous pollutant of the human body, and it contaminates nearly 93% of the population. So it's a very widespread population, and it's specifically a potent developmental toxin at very low doses. So it disproportionately affects infants and young children. So a brief timeline of how BPA came about to be introduced to the world and how it was regulated. So it was first invented in 1891. And the first scientific study reporting the BPA toxicity came in the 1930s. And with that, the BPA's widespread use began in the 40s and the 50s when it was used to make this new hard plastic polycarbonates and used to make these epoxy resins used in these food cans. And with its widespread use came a lot of scientific studies, and with that, the EPA and FDA also conducted their own experiments to investigate the toxicity of this compound BPA. And they said, okay, really high levels of BPA are needed for it to be really toxic to humans. But this was in contrast to a lot of the scientific studies that came out around this time, which said, no, this is really toxic, especially for infants and children. However, in 1999, FDA publicly asserts the safety of BPA for bottle-fed infants. So they say it's safe for infants. And with this increasing concern for the toxicity, the NIH put together an independent BPA experts, and they complete an assessment, and they say, yes, BPA is a risk for people. And in the meantime, as these regulatory Agencies are putting together their own studies. The scientific community are also putting their own studies. And from 2007 to 2008, there's a huge rise in concern over infant exposure to BPA through contaminated infant formula and baby bottles. And as a response to that, before any regulatory limits really kick in 2008, many manufacturers abandoned BPA in plastics, and California proposes to ban BPA in children's products. So the state-level regulations are kicking in before the federal ones. And FDA posts its draft risk assessment for BPA exposure in food packaging. And by 2009, over 20 states introduced bills to reduce children's exposure to BPA. And in the meantime, there's continuous scientific studies saying BPA is toxic. BPA bottles increase adult exposures by 70%. Something needs to be done. And in 2010, decades after the first reports of BPA's toxicity, US EPA issues plans to reduce environmental risks. So looking at this history of how BPA was investigated by scientific community as well as the regulatory committee, you can see that science does drive regulations in most cases, and regulations also drive science. So as these regulations came out to play, the scientific community also investigated how potential routes of BPA exposure, for instance, is it in our drinking water? Is it in the lake water? If I go swim in this lake, am I going to get BPA in my system? So in this case, there is a relationship between science and regulations. And it also is a very long, rigorous process, not only among the scientific community, but also by the regulatory agencies. They also conduct extensive research before setting any regulatory limits. So with this in mind, what is the scientific basis of the SEC's proposed climate risk disclosure rule? What are they saying that these companies have to disclose? So there are three main factors that they have to disclose. First is the material climate impacts, so risks from physical climate-related hazards and transition risks. Second, greenhouse gas emissions. And third, any targets or transition plans. Any existing targets around emission reductions, energy use, nature conservation, etc. So since we can't discuss all of the factors today, I'm going to focus on the scientific basis of the greenhouse gas emissions. Why are they focusing on greenhouse gas emissions? There are so many aspects of climate change, and they seem to be focusing on this one specific factor. And that is because greenhouse gases are indeed closely tied to climate change. So specifically, the Earth is about 1.1 degrees warmer than it was in the 1800s, so pre-industrial levels before we started releasing all of these gases into the environment. So on the left here, we have the change in global average temperature compared to the middle of the 20th century with time, and we can see a steady increase with industrial development and as our population has increased. On the right here, we have the change in atmospheric CO2 observed in Hawaii, and we can also see a steady increase starting from 1960 to 2020. So how are these linked? Does the increase in CO2 necessarily mean that it's resulting in this increase in the Earth's temperature? And there is a scientific fact behind this. It's known as the greenhouse effect. So as solar radiation passes through the Earth's atmosphere, most radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface and warms it. So this is why the Earth's temperature is not the same as out in the space, and we can live without these big spacesuits. But some of the radiation is reflected. And how the CO2 ties into this whole story is that some of the infrared radiation in the solar radiation passes through the atmosphere. Some of it's absorbed by these greenhouse gases and re-emitted in all directions. So the radiation is being absorbed by these gases and it's being re-emitted, which traps the heat in the atmosphere, resulting in an increase in the Earth's surface temperature and in the lower atmosphere. So greenhouse gas molecules are gases that are really good at this process and includes carbon dioxide and methane, which is why we see a lot of those words being thrown around when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions. So what have we done what have we done about this link between CO2 and climate change? So in 2015, there was an international treaty on climate change called the Paris Agreement, and it had three main objectives. And And one of them was to limit the average global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit this increase to 1.5 degrees. So why 2 degrees? That's what the scientists estimate to be the maximum temperature it can be before we see detrimental impacts of climate change. So we've seen the impact of climate change around us, unfortunately. We've seen very severe droughts, also flooding, and increase in sea level around the world. And they say that 2 degrees is the absolute limit before it really becomes very bad and beyond recovery. So are we on track to meeting this limit? Unfortunately not. So in 2019, greenhouse gas concentration reached new highs. CO2 levels were 148% of pre-industrial levels. And on the current path of CO2 emissions, temperature could increase by as much as 4.4 degrees C by the end of the century. So that's more than double our limit, and I don't even want to think about what the effect of that would be. So what can we do? To follow a 1.5 degrees C consistent pathway, the world will need to decrease fossil fuel production by roughly 6% per year between 2020 and 2030. So that requires commitment on the world and serious commitment to reduce this fossil fuel production. Also, emissions must drop by 7.6% per year from 2020 to 2030 to keep temperatures from exceeding 1.5 degrees C and 2.7% to stay below 2 degrees C. So this cannot be done by individuals. It requires serious commitment from everyone around the world. So is the SEC saying we have to cut down any sort of greenhouse gas emissions? So these emissions are divided into 3 different categories, scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 are emissions from sources that an organization owns or controls directly. 2, emissions that a company causes indirectly when the energy it purchases and uses is produced. 3, emissions that are not produced by the company itself and not the result of activities from assets owned or controlled by them, but by those that are indirectly responsible for up and down its value chain. So the proposed rule by the SEC will require reporting of scopes 1 and 2 emissions, which are emissions generated by the company's own operations through the energy it purchases. But they also require scope 3 disclosures when they are material or the fly has a target. For the SEC rule to be effective in trying to mitigate changes of climate change, the emissions reporting must be absolute in terms of intensity, both per unit of revenue, so that is greenhouse gases per dollar in sales or per unit of product, such as emissions per car manufactured. And filers would need to disclose how they arrived at those estimates and what greenhouse gases these estimates cover. So is it methane, carbon dioxide, et cetera, and the type of the source. So with that, I want to wrap up this part of the panel discussion. So I was able to discuss briefly on environmental regulations, that science has often driven regulations and regulations have often driven science. And it's a really long, rigorous process for both parties. And contrasting this with the new SEC rule, it's important to note that the SEC rule is not a regulation. So the companies don't have to necessarily change anything. They have to disclose what they're doing. So it's a disclosure rule. But there have been strong links between atmospheric greenhouse gas levels and climate change. So there is some scientific basis behind them mandating this disclosure of their greenhouse gas emissions. But there will be, for it to be effective, standardization and consistency, for instance, in measuring the CO2 emissions and quantifying it across reports will be critical to be able to really accurately compare what each company is doing. And with that, I would like to hand it over to our next panelist. Thank you for listening.
Our next panelist is Professor J. Scott Colasanti, has taught in securities regulation at Hofstra Law School for over 20 years. Previously, Professor Colasanti served as the youngest trial counsel within New York State Stock Exchange Division of Enforcement and as a long-term securities analyst arbitrator. He has authored over 25 articles addressing the prosecution of securities fraud, and other SEC issues. He has also authored 3 books, including Fairness Incorporated, The Origins and Billion-Dollar Bonuses of Rule 10b-5 as the American Insider Trading Prohibition. Professor Colasanti has taught and lectured abroad for over a decade and is a frequent contributor to the New York Law Journal. His most recent project, a podcast titled Stock Law Now, serves as a lighthearted take on business law issues of the day.
Good afternoon. Sorry, trying to live up to that introduction. Thank you, that was very, very kind. In my time today, what I'd like to do is briefly go through 4 points. First, very, very concisely introduce you to administrative law in terms of what this means when we say that the SEC proposals are pending. 2, dwell a little bit more on the substance. I know every panel member is going to touch upon the SEC proposals a bit. I'm going to see if I can do a deep dive and let you know how it compares with other rule proposals, and I guess more importantly, how the courts or other reviewing parties might treat the SEC in upcoming years. 3, I want to give you a status update. I know some of my students have been sending in comment letters. Right now, you can't do that unless they reopen the comment period, but also try to provide you with some dates as to how this works going forward. Finally, I'll conclude with 4 takeaways that hopefully will provoke some thought and give you, for what it's worth, my 2 cents on what is going to survive in this current rulemaking phase and what we need to all be concerned about. So firstly, let's focus on administrative law. I think I see one of my students there, but I'm not going to force him to chime in. You learn in legal writing analysis, your first weeks of law school, at the very top of the hierarchy of authority is the Constitution. And the great irony is you later go on to study administrative law and proposed rules and so forth, and you learn that, as I learned when teaching abroad, when a German PhD student actually confronted me and said, "Your agencies are mentioned nowhere in your Constitution." And I quickly backpedaled and said, "Yes, but we have the necessary and proper clause and all sorts of other wonderful catch-alls." The bottom line, the SEC nor any other federal agency is not mentioned in the Constitution, nor is the agency process. Yet it is undeniable that that is the means by which such a vast democracy is ruled. What does that mean? The Constitution says that Article 1 powers vested in the Congress can be delegated to these things we create called agencies. In turn, their pronouncements, which we call regulations or rules, will be upheld by the courts if they are found to follow intelligible guidance from the Congress. So that's the standard to keep in your back of your mind here. As this moves forward, you no doubt have heard already that the SEC proposals are triggering a great deal of controversy. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few moments, but just under the heading of administrative law, understand that the Administrative Procedure Act allows the SEC to go fully through its rulemaking process. Really, nothing will hold that up. They will listen to 5,000 comments. They may incorporate some of the substance of those comments. They may ignore those comments. But when they decide that the final rule is ready to be loosed upon all of us, that's pretty much within just their domain. At that point, once they present a final rule in the Federal Register, then the parties who feel that they are affected may go to court and try to enjoin the rule going forward, or a little-known obstacle that is becoming much more vogue. Since 1996, the Congressional Review Act allows Congress to hold up a rule. People who have petitioned Congress for that type of intervention have learned that that only actually transpires about 10% of the time. So to conclude this part on administrative law, understand, like it or not, the SEC is going to make a rule. Probably nothing is going to hold that up. The fun part comes once it is deemed final, what the people who are affected can do to alter it, get the SEC to repropose, or outright get the rule thrown away. Moving on to my second point, what is the substance of all this? Why are so many people outraged? The SEC in March first proposed what is known as the issuer proposal. The issuer proposal says if you are registered with the Commission as what we call a public company, I think the number that's often bandied about is about 12,000 or so, but good Lord, you could read this rule proposal forwards and backwards. You won't get an exact number, and I'm not pretending I read it forwards and backwards. What this means is nominally, if you are an SEC public company, what they call a registrant, you will have to, going forward, in your registration statement and your periodic reports, your quarterly filings, your annual report, you will have to make certain disclosures. And as Professor Su pointed out, these disclosures don't say you're going to necessarily do anything. What the disclosures aim for is the collection and dissemination of data. And those disclosures were articulated for you by Professor Su. I would just add one more category. If there's any legislation or regulation or business trend that would affect your business model, that should be disclosed in your filings as well. Now, the issuer proposal is very much concentrated on greenhouse gas. And as you heard, that's divided up into scope 1, meaning the direct greenhouse gases that you emit. Scope 2, the indirect gases that your companies or plants emit. And scope 3 is really the controversial part. It says that the registrant, the company registered with the SEC, the thing we know as a public company, could be Walmart, could be Merrill Lynch, would have to somehow calculate what the other entities in its value chain are doing about this. You'd have to somehow account for third-party emissions. This is a pretty revolutionary thought. Specifically, the SEC is just seeking to amend the seminal 2 laws in its whole arsenal of laws it enforces, the 33 Act and the 34 Act. And to their credit, they're just doing what they always do. They're focusing on disclosure and saying that we have to give a complete scorecard to the American investor. But in the details, what they are saying is you not only have to start to look at things differently where you are, you have to calculate these very specific scientific standards, things like internal carbon price and so forth. But you also have to figure out who in your business model is part of getting your product to market and give us a number for them as well. And that really poses tremendous obstacles. Not surprisingly, 21 state governors wrote to the president, wrote to the SEC, said withdraw this rule proposal immediately. This is just politics disguised as regulation. You are just targeting traditional means of energy. In turn, a somewhat larger group filed a comment letter with the SEC, making some very strong remarks, saying that this is arbitrary and capricious rulemaking, saying this violates our First Amendment rights and that you're forcing us to speak. Probably the most interesting political confrontation centers on something that came from a Supreme Court decision back in June. Don't know if you've been paying attention, but the Supreme Court's been a little busy in the last few months. The same month that they made people, let's say, pay more attention to them with both the gun decision and the abortion decision, they also had a somewhat complicated decision called West Virginia versus the EPA. And in that decision, the court told the EPA, we've had enough with administrative agencies making law. Specifically, the concurrence of Justice Gorsuch said, administrators in this country have become a ruling class of largely unaccountable ministers. This is the environment for federal agencies right now. So when the SEC says not only are you going to go from a protocol of you should disclose to you must disclose, not only are you going to disclose what you do, but what others do, and thirdly, that we're making this now a requirement, meaning just the failure to disclose is a disciplinary offense. It has, in the current context, stirred a lot of strong feelings. Now, before I go on to the second proposal that's pending, just wanted to open up for this panel to comment on a little bit. I think the press has done us a little bit of a disservice in recent months, and I'll tell you why. they have portrayed this battle as the entrepreneurs against an overly ambitious agency trying to act like the EPA. And that's not completely accurate. To be sure, there's something for almost anyone to oppose in these SEC proposals. But the SEC said a generation ago that they were going to go down this road. They also previously issued clear guidance saying that you should be taking these things into account, not just for the benefit of your investors, but for your own benefit. Because if you run afoul of state laws or other applicable standards, it's going to hurt your bottom line. So it's not that the SEC is late to the party. It's not that they are acting as a branch of the EPA. To the contrary, they are really digging in on this notion of investor protection. And I think Professor Su mentioned it. It's the comparable standards rationale, saying that we need everyone to be talking to investors in the same language, the same documents at the same time for any of this to make sense. I think that is the strongest argument the SEC has. They're not trying to become a super agency. They're just digging in one specific area, and if it ends up having tremendous benefit for all of us, well, all the better. The other thing I would say, and certainly I'm not here to defend the SEC, but I do want it to be a fair fight, they do point out in these lengthy, complicated proposals, the two of them total over 700 pages, but the trained eye goes right to where they say things like, 17 states already comply with greenhouse gas reporting. So all you're doing is taking that information and giving it to us at the SEC. Further, they do try to calculate exactly what type of burden this is. And they say, we're talking about 6,000 filings with the SEC each year that might be affected. And again, about a third of those 6,000 filings would already touch upon this information. So they have at least two things in their favor. But moving on, the second thing the SEC did this year was 2 months after the first proposal, roughly the spring, I believe, April. It was May. They said, we have a second proposal, not speaking to public companies, but speaking to the vast universe of funds out there, mutual funds, private funds, so forth. And we'll call this the investor proposal. And in the investor proposal, here's the ill we're targeting. Too many funds out there vying for your money, vying for the money of pension funds and tremendous entities like that, are claiming to be green, are claiming that they are heroes of sustainability. And since we already told the public companies, well, you got to back that up, you got to collect the right data, and you got to disclose it, it only makes sense that in the interest of reliable, comparable information for all investors, the funds of the world also undertake these disclosure duties. Now, again, the same types of things were demanded, that you look at your greenhouse gas emissions of the companies you're investing in. It's somewhat of a softer regulation, for lack of a better word, in this regard. Whereas every public company would have to comply with the first proposal, the second one, you kind of trigger your own duties. If you fall into one of three categories, namely if you are an integrated fund that sometimes considers sustainable investments, or if you are an ESG-focused fund, meaning you tell your investors that we are primarily out to be sustainable, or you are a high-impact fund, meaning that you actively advertise to people, we are going to change things at a certain company. If you fall into one of those categories, you have differing disclosure duties, all hovering about these same things that were demarcated in the issuer proposal. Surprisingly, even though this second proposal does have more of a discretionary feel, although it does speak to less people and sometimes doesn't speak to funds at all, it incurred even more wrath in the popular press, that the government through the SEC was doing what the EPA couldn't do, that this is just more of a political agenda, that people are adults, they know where to put their money and they don't need to be told, and so forth, things like that. The comment period on that proposal ended in August. Together, these two proposals drew 5,000 comments, one of the most popular proposals ever. Even though the issuer proposal speaks to both domestic and foreign companies, the opposition in those comments can largely be attributed to domestic companies. And the next speaker, Professor Bakarich, will tell you why that is. But again, probably the strength behind the SEC dual proposals is that they are just asking for disclosure. Secondly, that a lot of these entities probably are undertaking this type of examination anyway. Thirdly, that the states are requiring these things. Here is some cause for ire underlying all this vocal opposition. On this notion of scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures of greenhouse gases, the SEC, by its own estimation, calculates that each company would spend between $700,000 and $1.2 million a year. Add to that an additional direct cost of $500,000 to $700,000 for the other types of disclosures required by these proposals. And you start to understand why people are saying this is lunacy, this is unprecedented, this is the SEC trying to be EPA plus. The status of all this, the comment period's over. They may reopen it. If anyone feels strongly about it, send me an email. I'll show you how to write a comment letter. I love writing them. They are read, and if you get a kick out of these types of things, they post each of them on their website. So be careful what you say. In terms of implementation, I don't want to relegate today's panel to anything less than vital, but at least the issuer proposal carries with it its own implementation chart that says even if things go swimmingly, this stuff won't start for 2 years. Now, my best guesstimate would be they won't finalize all this to sometime next year, and then they'll have to move that chart forward accordingly. So we're talking about things a few years in the future. However, if you are a fan of this subject of sustainability and the government's intervention in this area, you will see that even the hint of regulation often inspires a great deal of commerce. You can go online and see numerous businesses that are already saying, come to us because the SEC rules are coming and we'll help you get ready for it. Further, in a less commercial sense, having studied the SEC for as long as I have, I see that when something controversial is proposed, the electorate, if you will, of the SEC kind of divides in half. A generation ago, they demanded more disclosure about corporate executive pay, and Wall Street balked and said, we shouldn't have to tell you every perk we give upper management, freedom of contract, and all sorts of good things like that. Just the threat that the SEC was focusing on executive compensation pay inspired certain corporations to willfully disclose it. I remember at the time showing my class that Home Depot had taken out an ad in Newsday saying, look how little we're paying our CEO. That was before any final regulation applied to Home Depot. So there is a tremendous effect, even if these things are contentious, even if things are watered down, even if these things don't actually come to fruition for a few years. Finally, let me suggest what are my 4 takeaways. I gladly defer to my panel if they have other takeaways, but I just did want to start the ball rolling. Number 1, I would say this rule is going to happen. It's not going to be stopped. The interesting thing then is to see where the opposition sues and if the current Supreme Court climate changes. And maybe they go from thinking that the administrative agency state is something to be suspected to a more temperate view. Secondly, even the circuit courts are presently hostile towards the SEC. If you've been following SEC cases in recent years, they've been told you don't appoint your administrative law judges the right way. You conduct internal proceedings that are unconstitutional. And when you say you are engaging in disgorgement, meaning you are giving funds back to investors, you're not engaging in disgorgement and the money's not going back to investors. The courts have been hitting the SEC with blow after blow, saying go back and read the Constitution. So it's not just the mood at the Supreme Court with their suspicion of the administrative state, It's the circuit courts hearing appeal after appeal saying, you know, SEC, we trusted you for too long. That is definitely on the horizon. Thirdly, what is often silent in all of this, we hear that these proposals talk about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 makes a lot of sense, right? It's a public company, and whether or not they are telling us all they can about their own emissions. And Scope 2 even makes sense because it's a public company telling us about the indirect effects of their emissions. Scope 3 is a public company being asked to vouch for everyone it does business with. And we know the SEC is overreaching here because they created a safe harbor from class actions for Scope 3 emissions. What are they saying? They're saying, we know how this is going to pan out. A company is going to have a hard time gathering this data from counterparties. It's going to be problematic. People may sue over it. So even in the initial proposal, they include a safe harbor from civil litigation for companies engaging in Scope 3 disclosures. What does the trained eye take from that? Yeah, but you didn't include safe harbors for Scope 1 and Scope 2, meaning it's open field day for class action attorneys. I'm not being the prototypical America's a fun place to sue professor. What we are seeing right now is a whole host of very experienced, trained class action law firms bringing cryptocurrency class actions even before there's cryptocurrency rules. That's what class action attorneys do. They say regulation's coming. We know what fair is. We don't need a regulation to tell us. They are already bringing cryptocurrency class actions. These proposals are going to inspire ESG, emissions disclosure related lawsuits. And unfortunately, the SEC did not account for all that. Finally, I do think there's a positive note to everything here. These letters from the Republican governors that criticized the SEC, the other critics, the Wall Street Journal, the people saying the SEC has lost its mind, they all may ultimately carry the day. But the effect on the American conscience is undeniable. The fact that we're here today talking about it, the fact that people are trying to read 700-page SEC proposals, the SEC has put it on the radar screen. And I think my panelists would agree with me that for any perceived or substantial shortcomings in these dual SEC proposals, at least the topic has been teed up for debate. And that is what the SEC does best. We read about them in the paper for bringing insider trading cases or getting billion-dollar fines, but if you actually look at the scorecard of their 90-year existence, what they do best is write rules. They are the experts. They engage in Section 553 rulemaking perfectly. They read the 5,000 comments, they put the comments on the website, and they get a rule out there, and we move forward. So I would leave you as a final thought. Yeah, I think there's some real problems with it in its present state. I understand the very vocal opposition to it, but thank God the SEC has gone down this path, forcing us to learn things like high-impact fund and greenhouse gases and so forth. I'll stop there. I now gladly turn it over to Professor Bakarich, who's going to talk about both this voluntary reporting that the SEC references and, of course, the international standards that we're lagging behind.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kathleen Bakarich is an assistant professor of accounting in the Frank G. Zarb School of Business. She spent a year in Germany on a Fulbright scholarship studying international accounting. Before joining Hofstra, Dr. Bakarich worked as an auditor, RSM LLP in New York City, and as a licensed CPA in New York. Her research and teaching focus on sustainability and emerging technology in accounting. At Hofstra, she created the course Sustainability in the Global Accounting Environment. In 2020-2021, she was named Teacher of the Year for the Frank G. Zarb School of Business.
Thank you. So this part of the panel I title, Why Are There Two Accounting Professors on this panel about science and climate change. And so my two colleagues that already presented set the stage well, and myself and my colleague, Professor Jones, will take the standpoint of the financial market a little bit and the accounting perspective. So the title of the panel, Science and Regulation, and kind of what's driving the theme science versus regulation, which is the driver. And the reason accountants enter the game here is because that important piece is investors and the market driving this science and regulation debate. And so investors and the market are starting to care about ESG and sustainability, so the SEC cares about ESG and sustainability, and what the SEC cares about impacts accountants' everyday jobs, and so therefore that leads into us caring about it. This is not a new area that companies have been reporting on. So in 2011, about 20% of S&P 500 companies voluntarily created a sustainability report. So a separate report not sent to the SEC, but available on their website, talking about climate-related risks, some of them GHG emissions, and other ESG factors. Flash forward to 2020, and 92% of S&P 500 companies are voluntarily disclosing this information in sustainability reports. And they're doing so because, again, the market and investors are demanding that information. And so really that's the SEC stepping in now and recognizing that there's a lot of information out there that isn't coming under the investor protection of an SEC filing and isn't coming, as Professor Jones will talk about, under the scrutiny of external assurance or verification of this information. And another reason the SEC really stepped in is because accountants created a lot of acronyms and what we call the alphabet soup of reporting as it relates to these ESG standards. What I mean by that is there's a lot of organizations that popped up that said, hey, I have a way that you can report on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, or I have a way and a set of standards that you can follow so that you can prepare these sustainability reports. Over 10 different types of acronyms and standards that you can follow and say, well, according to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is a not-for-profit organization, this is how I'm going to report my GHG emissions. Or according to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, this is how I'm going to report my information. And accountants, we don't like things that aren't standardized. We like to have our rules, and we like to follow those rules. And when it comes to financial reporting, there's a set of rules that are standardized across the US that we follow. But when it comes to sustainability reporting, there was no such standard. And so these 92% of S&P 500 companies that have been reporting this information for the past several years were not following any type of prescribed format or prescribed set of disclosures that they needed to follow. And so this is really where the SEC decided to step in and say there is no comparability for investors in order to understand what these companies are truly reporting. So this is really where, then the market is driving that regulation with the SEC coming in. As Scott had mentioned in some of the statistics as well that he cited, a lot of information is already out there, and the SEC is just trying to bring it in to their standard reporting. So scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions aren't something that's too new that these companies are reporting. 96% of the S&P 100 is already reporting scope 1 and 2 emissions in these sustainability reports. Now they're going to have to make sure it adheres to SEC standards and exactly how they want it disclosed, and that'll be subject to assurance. But the information is already publicly available and out there, and what a lot of these companies are willing to report on. The reason accountants care about this disclosure and this information is because it has financial statement impacts, potentially. So as Professor Su pointed out, the SEC is focused on kind of two elements of risk that sustainability has on companies. The physical risk. If I have a warehouse full of my product and that's sitting on a coastline that might be flooded very shortly, that is a financial risk. It's a physical risk, but that's a huge financial risk in terms of that cost. And then there's the transition risk that was also mentioned. So that's the risk that there's going to be a new trend, a new regulation, as was mentioned, that's going to impact my operations. So these are elements that will have financial statement impacts, and that's, again, the element where accountants particularly come into play, because this needs to be now quantified. And so we need to understand what the impact will be on financial metrics. So the trends are out there. The information is out there in a non-standardized format, and what is really trying to be done now with the regulation is bring it in to make it comparable. And so as Professor Colasanti said, I wanted to also bring in a little bit of a perspective internationally what's going on. And my particular area or region that I focus on is Europe. So I have a little bit more of an understanding of that region of the world. So that's what I'll report on, although other regions of the world are certainly making progress in this area as well. And so in the EU is really becoming a leader in terms of their mandates and what they're requiring of companies. And they have sort of a similar regulation that the SEC is passing. They call it the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Disclosure. And that's, again, requiring this disclosure on sustainability risks and opportunities. However, the EU and a lot of other countries and regions around the world take a slightly different perspective than the US does. They focus on what's called double materiality. So in the US, we really care about a little bit more of the planet's impact on a company. So if I have my warehouse on a coastline and that's going to flood, I want to report that in my SEC report because that's going to be a cost to me. It's going to be an extra expense of all of my product was destroyed, I have to rebuild my warehouse. The EU is taking the perspective of more so the impact also the impact of the business on the planet. And so there's this concept of double materiality going back and forth of not just what are the risks to a company, but what risk does the company pose to the environment. And certainly reporting on these different greenhouse gas emissions in the US is an element of showing the company's impact on the environment, but it's from the lens of really financial impact. And the lens of investors caring about that. And this is a broader stakeholder approach that's taking hold in the EU. And why we should care, why US companies might care about what's going on in the EU, is that the EU has said that any company operating in the EU that generates net sales of 150 million euros, which is not a high amount for a company, and they have at least one subsidiary or branch in the EU, will be subject to these new sustainability standards. So a US company that has a subsidiary operating in the EU and has at least 150 million euros in sales will now have to adhere to the EU's sustainability disclosure standard. And the EU has stated that what this SEC 400-page proposal requires is not sufficient according to EU standards. So they've really raised the bar in terms of the additional information that needs to be disclosed, and a US company can't come along and say, well, there's this whole new SEC rule and I followed that and this should be sufficient. The EU rule also does focus a lot on the S&G elements of ESG, so social and governance as well. So we're talking an even broader umbrella than just climate. And around the world, the UK is also requiring companies to disclose greenhouse gas emissions. These are regulations that have already been passed as well, so they're not really up to the same debate that's currently going on, although there's certainly some minor pieces that are being debated and explained. So globally, the trend is already there, and you could say, in a sense, the US is catching up a little bit. It's not perfect all over the world. It's not to say that the EU knows exactly what they're doing, and everybody all the companies have fallen in line and are just saying, yes, this is what we will do. But I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture of other markets as well, and this is not as we know, not a US-only problem or a US-only area that they're focusing on. And I think certainly companies can take a look at what is going on globally to get a sense and understand. And once again, the goal is to have comparability. So the goal is that what is being reported on a sustainability report or how greenhouse gas emissions are calculated by a company in France should be fairly similar to that calculation in the US, because investment happens globally as well. And this concept of the circle sort of the business and the planet and which way the impact should be reported also translates into investors and their concern with ESG investment. As Professor Colasanti mentioned, the second element of the SEC regulation, or their second proposal, was about these ESG labeled funds. And that's also really the debate in the finance world, a little bit separate from the accounting world. But if something's labeled ESG, are we focused on investing in it because its impact on the planet is good? Or are we focused on investing because the business itself is deciding that they're taking ESG risk factors into consideration when they're planning their future operations? And so the perspective does end up mattering a little bit in terms of what we label as something as green. Technically, you could label an oil and gas fund as green if they're working towards renewable energy. But a lot of other people would say oil and gas would never be considered green, and it shouldn't be part of anything labeled ESG or sustainable. So the world and regulation and accountants are still sort of struggling with this concept of, are we talking about the impact of the business on the planet or the planet on the business, and which one is really driving what investors care about and in terms of what companies want to report about. So I do want to get time for people to ask questions and for the panel to be able to interact a little bit. So I wanted to keep this rather brief, but just kind of sum up to explain that accountants are involved in this process because anything that the SEC requires and companies are required to report, accountants are the ones preparing that information, helping to compile that data. And whenever there's an impact on a financial statement or any dollar amounts that a company is reporting, that's where accountants step in. So that's sort of my overview of how accounting enters this discussion, because to non-accountants seems like a strange field that sort of enters in. And so that's just kind of the broad strokes that I wanted to paint in terms of accounting and what's going on internationally. And I want to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Jones, to bring in another element of accounting before we open it up to more discussion.
Thank you. Our next panelist, Dr. Richard C. Jones, has been teaching accounting and financial reporting in the Frank G. Zarb School of Business since 1997. Dr. Jones is also a non-practicing CPA, having obtained his license in Pennsylvania many years ago. Before entering academe, Dr. Jones was a practicing accountant. During his 15 years in accounting, Dr. Jones worked in banking and financial services, was on the staff of the Financial Accounting Standards Board, and was a supervisory staff at Global Professional Services firm. Dr. Jones has authored or co-authored numerous articles and participated in academic and professional conferences addressing accounting and auditing, including sustainability and ESG reporting and assurance services. He has also co-authored a book on international accounting for revenue recognition. Dr. Jones serves on the editorial advisory board of the CPA Journal and chairs the International Accounting and Auditing Committee of the New York State Society of CPAs. He is also an active member of the Society's Sustainability Committee and participated on a task force that prepared the Society's response to the 2022 Corporate Sustainability Reporting Proposals of the International Sustainability Standards Board.
Thanks, Andy. Hello. It's tough to be the last person to speak because you're so fired up by what the other folks said. So I'm going to try to discuss providing assurance services to sustainability reported information quickly, because I want to get to the question and answer portion, because I have some comments I want to make about those things. If you don't take anything else out of this discussion, I was going to say out of my comments, but I'm going to say out of the total discussion, you should take out you should recognize these points. User demand for this information is very, very high. And they want this information to have independent verification. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Providing independent verification of corporate sustainability reporting. 2, companies already provide this information to the market. All of it. If they didn't, they still know this information. I can't run a public company and not know my accessibility to my natural resources that I use to provide my service. So when you hear that the request for this information isn't valuable, and if you're asking companies to do something that they haven't been asked to do in the past, it's just not true. It can't possibly be true if, as a senior executive in an organization, I want to be successful in running my corporation today and prepare my corporation to be successful in the future. It's just not possible. What they're really saying is, we don't want our information to be transparent. We don't want that information to be made public. And the last thing they want is to have that information subject to independent verification. And I can explain why that is during the question and answer session. Number 3, number 2, users demand, I missed one. Number 3, it's all happening really fast. We have new regulation. We have new regulation from the SEC. We have accounting standard setting organizations, both in the US and globally, trying to establish better reporting processes and better reported information. And this is my topic. We also have standard setting organizations globally and in the US trying to establish clear rules to guide the independent verifiers, which we'll call auditors. That's not actually what we call this stuff. Auditors provide auditors with guidance on how to conduct an evaluation of a report that is non-financial in nature. Typically, accountants are trained to prepare reports and to audit or evaluate reports on historical financial information. We're much less well trained on providing verification and reporting on non-financial information, let alone scientific and engineering-based information. So when we talk about having ESG reports subject to independent third-party verification, particularly by professional accounting service firms, we're asking accountants to step in and provide this verification information for which we're not really that well trained for. That's the other big point. It's happening very fast. We have to deal with the regulations, the nature of the information, which is very different, and we also have to make sure we remember our own natural expertise and also the codes of conduct that support our behavior. Okay, that's what I want to put out there. So what is the issue associated with assurance services? That's what I'm here to talk about. Providing third-party verification to the reports that are issued on sustainability. Well, we currently, if a company issues a sustainability report and they want verification from an accounting firm has 2 levels of verification they can provide. One is called limited assurance, and the other is called reasonable assurance. Limited assurance is, we looked at this information, and we haven't really seen anything in the information that was provided that was not consistent with the criteria that were established, and therefore we do not offer a negative opinion on this information. So we call it negative verification. Reasonable assurance is like an audit. If we give reasonable assurance, what we basically say is, and I want to make sure I say this clearly, the accounting report provides positive assurance that in their opinion, the information provided is prepared and presented in accordance with the stated criteria in all material respects, and it's fairly stated. In reasonable assurance, you're providing the level of verification that gives the user comfort that they're looking at information that can be relied upon. In limited assurance, you're just saying, we read it. We didn't find a problem with it. Right now, about 58% of the reports that are issued globally have some form of assurance services. 58%, that's a very low number, right? 92% of the companies issue reports. Of those reports, only 58% receive some level of verification. In the United States, so that's globally, in the United States, different reports, different surveys offer a different level of assurance. So I'll say it's between about 39%, which was actually reported in a paper by Katie and her co-authors, and a report by a group of professional organizations, the International Federation of Accountants, the American Institute of CPAs, and CIMA, which is the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, which is a global organization. They gave a number of about 80%. So somewhere between 39% and 80% of the US reports have some level of assurance. And the difference, by the way, between the 39% and 80% is associated with the sample size of the surveys. The 39% is a small sample size, and certainly sometimes in small samples you have a bias low, and the 80% is a very large sample size. But what we have in the US is that clearly there's not a lot of assurance provided on the reports issued here. Now, if I look at the studies on global assurance, it turns out that the US is really amongst, we have higher levels, more assurance on our reports than in other jurisdictions. We're at the high end. Remember, globally overall, it's about 58%. So if we're somewhere around 70, 80%, we're above the global level. The other issue that we have when it comes to providing assurance is that there's no current authoritative literature to guide providing assurance on sustainability reports. There's guidance there's offered guidance to auditors on how they should provide, conduct an engagement on reporting on, that look at non-financial information. And most of the auditors or accountants who do this type of assurance work rely on that guidance. But when it comes to specific guidance related to sustainability reports, that's currently in process. So while we're developing disclosures that are mandatory, we're also trying to develop guidance to auditors on how to conduct the work. I have some information. When we look at the guidance that's out there, in the US, we don't have guidance that is specific, but there is some guidance internationally. There's a group called the International Audit Insurance Standards Board. They issued guidance that looks at providing assurance services for greenhouse gas emissions. And that's actually authoritative and it's specific. So with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, when an auditor does work, when an accountant is asked to provide services, they will often rely on the international guidance because there's no guidance in the US. So that's where you see most of the guidance, most of the guidance that supports the work of the accountant. When assurance is received on these reports, what you typically see is that the provider of the assurance, whether it's an accountant or it's a consultant, they will typically give their report on only a limited part of the report that they're looking at. Typically, something that's measurable. Greenhouse gas emission metrics, metrics on the company's social-related discussion, because they feel that they can offer, they can clearly evaluate measured reported information. Unfortunately, sustainability reports address a lot broader set of topics than just metrics. Sustainability reports often discuss strategies, risks, and opportunities in a broad sense, and also approaches used by the organization or planned approaches to mitigate any risks or to achieve any goals. Well, from the standpoint of being an accountant who's providing assurance, it's very hard to provide assurance on qualitative information, particularly qualitative information that's forward-looking. And so one of the big challenges for accountants when they're asked to provide assurance to these reports is that it's much more difficult to put yourself in a position of evaluating forward-looking information that's non-quantitative. It's much easier, obviously, to provide assurance on quantitative metrics. The other big challenge for accountants is exactly what Professor Backridge spoke about. Right now, or I shouldn't say right now, but up until about November of 2021, the number of organizations providing sustainability reporting guidance was extensive. There were about 5 major organizations, but in a speech at a sustainability discussion outside the U.S., one sustainability expert said that if you look globally, the number of organizations providing sustainability-related guidance numbered in the thousands. That there were a lot of small and local jurisdictions that had their own separate guidance that large companies were subject to meeting. And so as a result, when companies are allowed to prepare their sustainability reports, they can look to the guidance they feel most comfortable with. These reports are voluntary. And so in their reports, they'll tell you where their guidance came from, and more often than not, the sustainability reports that are issued include guidance from 2 or more separate sustainability frameworks or standard setters. Now, when you issue a report like that, you're required to say what were the guiding standards that you're applying so that the reader understands where your discussion comes from. But the idea that because it's voluntary, the idea that you've used rules from 3 or 4 different standard setters sort of causes the reader to have less comfort that this report is reliable, and it also makes it more difficult to compare the report for one company, even in a particular industry, to another company within the same industry. So there's lack of comparability across sustainability reports. So if I'm an auditor or a consultant coming in and being asked to evaluate these reports, one of the problems I have is I can't say that these reports are comparable to other reports, and I don't know that I can rely that they've applied a consistent, standardized framework, which is what the goal is now with the SEC reporting and also the rules that are coming out in jurisdictions around the world. They're trying to get to a point where at least when reports are issued in their own jurisdictions, they're based on one standardized report. And I do want to point out that even as jurisdictions are issuing their own disclosure requirements, they're working together with other jurisdictions and other global standard setters to try to standardize the required disclosures and the language used in the guidance for preparing those reports. So globally, what we're going to probably find is a convergence towards a very consistent set of rules for issuing sustainability reports. The other issue I want to point out is that where we have so many, so right now in the US, if a public company issues a report on financial accounting standards, those report 100% of the companies are following the same set of standards, and every report includes an auditor's opinion. Now, I just mentioned that globally and within the US, when sustainability reports are issued, only about 58% to 70% include even a very limited opinion from some third party. You sort of have to ask yourself, well, why is that? To boil it all down, I'll say that you have a profession, the insurance providers, who probably are resistant to providing the service because, like I talked about, there's a lack of guidance from their standard setters on how they should provide that service. And on the part of the corporations issuing those reports, they have two issues. One is they're not required to have a assurance for their reports. The public might want it, but they're not mandated to do it. And number two, and this is an issue that often is ignored, they have to pay for that assurance. If I contact the public accounting firm or I contact a consultant and ask that firm to come in and provide assurance for this report I prepared, then they're going to propose, they're going to tell you how much it's going to cost for them to do the work. My last year of working in industry was in 1992. The cost to do the audit for the company I worked for, and it was a major institution, was about $5 million to do the audit, the financial statement audit. And we had actually reduced the fee from about $7 over about a 2-year period. Sustainability reports cover more information. The nature of that information is more diverse, and to do that work, an accounting firm would have to bring in more expertise because a lot of that work is subject to engineering and science-related metrics that an accountant isn't trained for. So therefore, you have to break in the expertise. My guess is the cost to provide assurance at an audit level for a sustainability report would far exceed the cost to provide the financial statement audit. And as a result, companies are saying, is there a benefit to the organization to incur that significant a cost for a report that, as far as we currently know, may not have as much impact on my stock price or the way the market views my organization relative to what my cost is. So there may not be a benefit to the organization relative to the cost. And that still is yet to be demonstrated. So that's going to be probably amongst the major comments made to the SEC as we start to roll out these reports. Does the cost of this work, does the benefit exceed the cost? And then you have the issue of lack of regulatory requirement. You have the challenge on the part of the auditors to say that, well, hey, I don't really have expertise or ability to audit forward-looking information. The other thing that firms have, the providers of the service have to deal with is upscaling and the cost of upscaling their staff, and also dealing with non-standardized information. So until we have good required reporting, it's more difficult to provide service on reports that are so varied. So I do want to talk about the future rather than continue talking about the past. We know that this is coming. More importantly, the SEC in the US and the European Union outside the US are not only asking for more standardized, more comprehensive, comparable, and consistent reporting that's reliable on sustainability, but they want those reports to be integrated with the financial statement reports. They want an integrated set of reports that look at the whole organization. If the report is integrated, then it's automatically subject to the review and audit of the CPA exam, CPA, the independent public accountant who provides the audit of the financial statements. Auditors in the US provide two services. They provide reliability with respect to reporting. They also provide an opinion on the quality of the internal controls over financial reporting. So the supply chain that supports the providing of the information that goes into the report. So they offer an opinion on the system of internal controls, and they offer an opinion on the financial statements. What that means is, if we integrate the report, sustainability and financial reporting, then we will also have to, the accountants that provide the assurance will have to have the skills required to provide an opinion on the system of information and internal controls over that information that supports the reporting of that information. Therein lies the challenge of upskilling their people, of identifying experts who can then become a part of their organization to help them provide that service, and then being able to provide that service, that report, with the level of comfort that they haven't exposed themselves to litigation risk because maybe they missed something, right? The cost of missing something in that report will be pretty excessive. You know, we've had numerous situations where companies have greenwashed their report. Now the auditor, if this is an integrated report, will have to sort of read those reports with the idea that information in this report could influence someone to make an investment decision or a lending decision, and if that information isn't accurate or at least reliable, then the auditor is exposed for having given an opinion on that report that it was reliable, and also for maybe having not performed their work consistent with the rules of the profession. So in the profession, that would expose you to professional risk, civil risk, and criminal risk, because all levels of risk are associated with the reporting on financial statements. So there's a long road ahead of us when it comes to providing the assurance services necessary associated with the information that's going to come out of sustainability. And for the accountant, a lot of that road is associated with our preparing ourselves to provide that service, both through training and also developing the types of standards and regulation that will guide us in providing that service. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank the panelists for weaving the narrative, starting with the scientific perspective, and then moving on to where the government and the SEC is moving in terms of new regulations and some of the pushback on that in terms of the comments that are being put forth, and then looking to see how that then translates into the tasks ahead for accountants and for auditors and so forth. We don't have very much time for questions, but I ask your indulgence for a few minutes. Maybe if some members of the audience have some questions, we could entertain a couple of those. You step up to the microphone if you have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
When these rules come into effect next year, could the SEC impose any fines on investment firms like BlackRock or asset managers like BlackRock if their disclosures reveal that the companies within their portfolio don't meet these standards that will be prescribed?
What the fund proposal is saying is in 3 distinct areas, you now have a duty to both report and be truthful. So in your registration statement, in your annual report to shareholders, and any investor brochures, you better make sure things are filed with us, and you better make sure that you are truthful to the best of your ability. Now, if it's material, which generally is interpreted in the securities laws as something the reasonable investor would like to know, very broadly, then it would be held, the failure or the violation would be held to a whole body of case law for any registrant failing to comply with reporting requirements or to do so in a way that omits material information. So yes, those civil fines are on the table. You've heard a little bit of reference of criminal penalties and so forth. The SEC can't bring criminal action, but what they can do per their Enabling Act is hand things right off to the DOJ and say, we think this was intentional and it warrants a parallel criminal action.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, in the reporting of this information, Sarbanes-Oxley established criminal penalties if misleading information is included in the annual report in the 10K report to the SEC, if that information, if the company was aware that information was not accurate or could be misleading. So as a result, when it comes to reporting by companies to the SEC, you're subject to criminal sanction, and of course civil is just being sued in court by a shareholder because they lost money. And then professional is because of our professional standards of the code of conduct. So you get all three in when it comes to financial reporting in the 10K report.
So I know this symposium is more about like the science and regulation and compliance, but with this, with all this happening now, do you think we'll see a shift into like social impact bonds, even though those are very recent developments? How do you think that will play into all of this? And do you think people will start shifting over there, or investors start shifting over there instead of ESG funds?
Yeah, so social impact bonds, just brief background. So if a company issues a bond, they're trying to get money for, typically it's for like a capital project, like building a new building, but this would be for a project that has a social impact. And what's interesting about these types of bonds, or there's even green bonds saying I want to raise money for some type of energy efficient project, is there is no real oversight over did they use that money for the intended purpose? And that's not really there right now. In the US, globally, it's sort of a little vague in terms of the follow-up that these companies need to do. There's a lot of not-for-profit initiatives. There's called the Climate Bonds Initiative, Social Bonds Initiative, that are trying to hold these companies accountable. And so it might be kind of the next element of potentially of sort of oversight that comes, because there is not that follow-up right now of understanding what companies are necessarily doing with those funds. And again, it does become a little qualitative versus quantitative, and how do you measure social impact, what they're doing, but you can measure the money that they have spent on certain initiatives. So I think it's something that the market is waking up to, and investors are thinking, well, I'm giving my money towards something and I don't have that documentation, or it's not publicly available. Companies might disclose it to those who have invested in those projects, but it's not available so much for us to track as a public. But it's an interesting area to keep note of, because these types of bonds are growing immensely. Green bonds is a huge new area of bond issuance, and socially linked bonds as well. It's a great question.
If I could just add, I hope it's not a trend, but Governor DeSantis in Florida just had a statute passed ordering the Florida Pension Fund to not invest with anyone who considers ESG factors. So I don't know if that rises to the level of a trend, but it is inspiring some bizarre political responses.
Any more questions from anyone? So just to wrap up, maybe taking a little bit from my perspective, which is in marketing, and taking more of an outward view in terms of consumers. For companies, one of the issues for consumers is a lot of confusion about if they, especially younger generation, wanting to do the right thing, patronize companies that are doing the work in terms of the environment and social issues and so forth. To what degree, first, would these standardizations and regulations help to tamp down greenwashing, not just for the investment community, but also for the average consumer, so they can make better decisions in the marketplace about what they want, and also to the extent to which the companies that really are doing the right things, the good actors, then really do benefit from this by having a standard set of regulations, and ones that we know are being verified by third parties, and can start putting some faith in the companies that are saying that they're doing the right thing. So is anything from that perspective that you think is noteworthy?
I would just quickly say, even on the SEC website, they acknowledge one of their primary missions is investor education. If they do get these dual proposals largely in present form adopted, I think they have a responsibility then to decipher this stuff for us. I think they can't just say, well, we went out there and we're your hero. You go find out now what a low-impact fund is or what an internal carbon price is. I think the next thing they have to do is fulfill one of their congressional mandates to engage in meaningful investor education and explain this stuff to us.
Yeah, and I would just add that, no consumer, even us accountants, are not going to read all of these SEC reports, but there's a lot of companies out there that have a ranking of the top 10 most sustainable companies in the world or in this industry, and we don't really understand how they rank and get that data for those companies because there's not a comparable standard that every company is following in terms of disclosure. So I think creating this SEC standard, then there are the ratings agencies and these other organizations that have then all of this comparable information that a regular consumer is never going to dig through an SEC report to understand, but they can take this comparable information and then really within an industry rank companies and say, hey, this is based on what they've reported. We now have this information to say, these are the top 10 most ESG friendly, and then consumers can read that report. And
Yeah, right. I mean,
so a little bit
you can almost envision something like consumer reports, adding that as another dimension and how consumers can choose among brands.
And it exists now, but it's not standardized, and
is
so
the problem.
you could Google all these different
You can
ratings.
pick and choose the ones that make you
exactly,
better.
there's one company on one list and they're not on the next.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, there's several studies that have looked at the rating agency reports, and they said that what they find is there's little correlation across those reports in terms of how they rate individual companies. So they're very low, there's very low correlation. And probably as we standardize the reporting and if we have better verification, what we're going to see is convergence of the quality of those reports, just like we see with bonds and things like that. And I think my argument with standardization is what I tell my students about investing in a stock. The best price of a stock right now is the price right now. And it represents all the information in public markets. And if that information is high quality, that price is good. When that information is low quality, that price is not reliable. So as we get better information, then that price is better.
Well, thank you all, and I want to thank the panelists, and hope you enjoyed it. Have a great evening.